Hi, and welcome back for another episode of Education in Focus. Today, we're chatting about reduced timetables. When should they and shouldn't they be used, and what you should be aware of? I have to admit, it's an area that I'm keen to understand more about, so I'm really looking forward to hearing Lisa and Jason's views on this. So, Jason and Lisa, welcome back.
Hi, good to see you
You
again.
too.
Hi, Leigh.
Hiya. So I guess the first thing really is, what do we mean when we say a reduced timetable?
It just means, literally as it says, really, where the school and the parents have agreed that a child or a young person needs to attend school for fewer hours than they normally would. And obviously, there's a kind of variety of reasons for why that might happen. Um, and it can be anything down to like a half-time timetable, for example, 50%, 60%, whatever. It'll always be very much dependent on the child's needs at the time.
Yeah, that's about it. So, if you look online, there's kind of like for different age groups, there is like an hourly guidance of what full-time education is, and anything less than that would be classed as a reduced timetable. But as Jason says, it could be 50%, could be 75%, it could be anything. It's just when they're not doing full time.
Brilliant. So now we've got that. Why are they used? When should they be used? What are they for?
Well, there's a number of reasons, and it's important to recognise that there's no statutory guidance about exactly when one should be used. But common examples might be if a child has medical needs, maybe physical health needs or mental health needs, and actually cannot be in school for a period of time. So that could be one reason where one might be used. It might also be if a child has had a period of absence, so say they have been off for a period of time and they need to work back up to full time, then again, a reduced timetable can be a nice short term measure to get them from not attending up to attending. And for that reason, as well, often when there's been school refusal, again, a part time timetable can help them work back up to being into full time education. So, although there isn't statutory guidance, it is for the reason why it should be used. Um, if there is a need to work a child back up to full time,
Mm-hmm.
then that is when you would use one. But what is very, very clear in the guidance is that it is a short term measure. It is not a long term agreement.
Mm. Yes, timetables should be seen as a very much a last resort measure because they're not necessarily a positive experience anyway. They're quite difficult to do, and they're not guaranteed to be successful. But they can be a sort of an emergency step if you need to. If it is at least just try and support the child back to full time, because that's the ultimate aim. It's got to be over a very short time. But yeah, it can't be considered as your first step. You've got to have tried other things first before you start just considering it.
I know we're going to talk about the process a little bit later on, but as part of that process is you have to evidence what you have already tried. Unless there is a very clear-cut medical reason why they haven't been in school, then you have to kind of evidence what you've tried to avoid coming to a reduced timetable. So yeah, it's your last resort, isn't it? Not your first step.
Yeah, and this definitely can't be considered a disciplinary measure. That's certainly not allowed. That's explicitly stated out in the guidance, and they can't be used for that reason. So you've got to look at other reasons for addressing behavioural issues. Obviously, if it's an unmet need, there might be something else going on, but it certainly can't be used as a sort of form of punishment, let's say. Um, and they're not considered an exclusion either. You can't include that as exclusion time.
And the guidance is very clear to schools, and it does discuss kind of the difference between exclusions and especially informal exclusions as well. So
Mm,
if schools are perhaps struggling to meet a child's needs, maybe they ask parents to come and pick them up quite regularly, and so effectively a child is having a reduced timetable but without the agreement that it's a reduced timetable, then the school is not doing it right because it's an informal exclusion but it's not being
yeah,
acknowledged as such, and it's counting actually towards a child's attendance figures as well. It's not counting in the right way. So yeah, they most definitely should not be used as a disciplinary measure.
yeah. And in fact, informal exclusions are not allowed either. So they're not. Schools are not allowed to do them. If they're going to exclude, they've got to do it properly through appropriate procedures and notify parents that. So if if anyone's listening to this and they're being asked to pick a child up on a regular basis, actually the school's not allowed to do that. Obviously if ill and you say, can please come collect them being sick, that's obviously perfectly reasonable. But if something else that's going on, if they're struggling to manage in the school and the school's saying, please can you come collect so and so because things are kicking off, well, maybe once that might happen, but it can't be a regular thing, and it can't be just something that can be expected that you could just be at the end of the phone ready to come and collect the child. That's not a solution. That's
Yeah.
responding to a situation that's not being managed properly for some reason.
I find that really interesting, working with a lot of our families where you do see reduced timetables being used where children are quite dysregulated at school.
Mm.
And it's really a fine balance then, isn't it, between is this reduced timetable because they can't emotionally manage the day, or are school actually using this as a behavioural method because it's difficult for them to manage that little one all day? And that's a really important distinction, isn't it, to make?
Mm. Yes, you've always got to be doing this for the needs of the child. So if discussions to be had about potentially reducing a child's timetable, it's got to be clear that the reasons are in the child's best interest.
Yeah, not in the school's best interests.
Absolutely.
And I do think it puts parents in a very difficult position as well, because if you know that your child is struggling at school, if you know that they are unhappy and they're showing that through their behaviour and the school are finding it hard to cope and they're asking you to pick them up, it's really hard as a parent to sit there and be, I'm not going to, or because you know your child is struggling. You recognise the school isn't meeting their needs. It's a really difficult situation to be in. Um, and it needs to be handled properly. An ongoing arrangement of you as a parent having to go and collect them is not it's not a solution. It's not being handled well. So
So we've talked really in that when they should and they shouldn't be used. I'd be interested to know if either of you can tell me, can reduced timetables be used when a child has an EHCP plan?
Rarely. Again, it's a very rare thing, and it would have to be in the HCP itself. It would have to be outlined in the provisions there, saying that this is something that there's a reason why a reduced timetable is considered appropriate for that child. And there should be clear goals about what the child's working towards, and there should be a time frame. So even there, the presumption would be that they attend full-time education because that's their entitlement.
yeah, and I think while preparing for this, I was reading yesterday, and if a child does have an EHCP due to having a disability, then the reasons for not attending should not be linked to their disability, because obviously that would then be discriminatory.
Mm.
So yes, they can be used if a child has a EHCP, but again, like Jason said, very rarely, and you have to be very clear about the reasons why.
Yeah, because these things aren't without risks in themselves, because there are dangers associated with the reduced timetable. Though, for example, that disconnect from stuff going on in school, disconnect from their friends, that sort of sense of not belonging properly, can be quite difficult over a longer term. So that's why it's important. It's got to be as much as possible a short period of time.
Yeah, that is absolutely massive for the children, the young people that we're talking about, because whilst they might struggle to be in school, if we reduce the amount of time they're in it, then their relationships with their peers, their relationships with their teachers are all impacted. They do feel like they belong to the school less. Schools move at a very, very fast pace, and I appreciate that's sometimes part of the problem and why a reduced timetable might be needed. But schools move at a very fast pace, and if children are not there and not included in it, then they miss out on things, and that just means that the gap between their peers and their significant adults just grows bigger and bigger.
Yeah.
Friendships move on without them, and other children might not meaningfully exclude them, but that child wasn't there when this thing happened, or they weren't involved in this piece of work that we did together, or and things just move on. And so that's one of the reasons why we have to be very clear, the short-term measures, because there are massive impacts of a child not attending school regularly. So
It's more than
yeah,
just the learning, isn't it?
it is. Although I will say, and you know me, I'm all for putting a child's needs first, but coming at it from an educational perspective, it has a massive impact on their learning as well. And I can understand that a child who's not feeling safe in school isn't going to be learning particularly well anyway.
course.
But certainly in a secondary school, lessons are dotted throughout the week. And I've worked in places where they've tried to do a reduced timetable where children only attended certain lessons, but then they're in and out of the school at different times on different days. And that creates massive safeguarding issues in terms of keeping that child safe. And also, it's quite labour intensive for parents to facilitate kind of them getting in and out of school. So that's one way of doing it. But I've also worked in schools where they've said, okay, well, we're just going to do 2 days a week, or we're just going to do 3 days a week. But then that means that they are attending lessons out of sequence. So they might go to a maths lesson on a Monday, miss it on a Tuesday, miss it on a Wednesday, go in on a Thursday, and that it just makes learning even harder. So yeah, I'm never one to kind of like put that as at the forefront. I know we need to look after our children's emotional well-being, but the learning is massively impacted when a child is on a
Yeah,
reduced
and actually
timetable.
that'll have emotional impact on them anyway, won't it? Because there'll be
Exactly.
that sense of missing out and not being able to cope, and so even less reason to want to go back. So there's a risk that you end up entrenching this pattern of non-attendance. I mean, if there's a clear rationale for what they're doing in the meantime, while there's a period of time for this reduced timetable, it might be that they're trying to recruit somebody because they realise that they need a member of staff to support your child, for example. And this may be considered appropriate to support that recruitment while they get that person in post. Then hopefully your child can return knowing there's somebody there for them. And that potentially, that sort of thing could be perhaps a rational reason why, but even that sounds a bit difficult, to be honest. I think it's very difficult to justify reduced timetables in most instances. I think they have to be very carefully considered. I don't think schools do them lightly either.
No.
So say that school then did think it wasn't in the child's needs, best interests to be at school for the whole day at the moment. What is the process? How does it even come about? Who decides? Who's involved? What's the plan?
Well, it could be either the school or the parents. You can, one of you might recognise as an issue and want potentially. Again, I'm assuming here we've had lots of discussions taking place so that the school's tried lots of things, parents been involved, supporting him in lots of ways, but clearly something isn't working yet. So it might be that somebody, even a parent, might say, at the moment, I think it's going to be important that we do reduce time. So there could be something going at home. There might be some therapy taking place where actually it might be appropriate for the child not to be going in full time because of other things that are happening that might not be directly related to the school. They could be related to the family circumstances. So it could be instigated by the parents. Often it's instigated by the school, but it has to be through an agreement. You can't impose it. That's absolutely true. They cannot impose it on any parent. So it's usually done through mutual agreement. Some sort of discussion has to take place with lots of thinking about the reasoning behind it. Again, making sure it's very clear about why is this decision in the interest of your child, rather than the interest of some others, like the school. That has to be very clear. And then once, and assuming agreements are reached between you all, they have to draw up a formal agreement. So something in writing that says what the reasons are, how long this reduced timetable is going to last for. So typically 6 weeks probably would be as long as most of them would be expected to go along. They can extend, but that's fairly standard. The amount of time reduction, so is it 50% reduction, 60% reduction, how much time is the timetable going to be reduced by? When, so which days they're expected to go in and what time they're coming home. And if that's happening, then the school actually has to notify the local authority that because the child isn't accessing full-time education in that situation. So as part of their responsibilities, local authorities are obliged to monitor this, which is obviously part of the accountability structure, which makes sense. And of course, within that agreement, you also have to agree when you're going to review it. So you'd expect to be reviewing it perhaps fortnightly, but probably weekly, just to see how it's going. So after the first week, is this working? Is the plan going according to plan? And it might be possible to accelerate the increase in time, or we might have to hold back a little bit. So, but the idea would be that over that period of, let's say, 6 weeks, expect the proportion of time the child spends in school to be increasing step by step by step by step, so that by the end of it, ideally they're back to full time.
So ideally, that would all go to plan. They'd go
Yeah.
back to school full
Ideal
time.
world.
Ideal world. What happens if it's been 6 weeks? They're not near. You try a little bit longer. It's not happening. What's the alternative to reduce timetables?
Well, that's a difficult one to answer because the reality is it's probably going to look different for every single child.
Yeah.
But a child is entitled to a full-time education.
Hmm.
Now, that full-time education does not have to be in a school. That
Okay.
education can be offered in different ways. So you have forest schools, you can have one-to-one tuition. All of this there's lots of different things to consider. And when I mention one-to-one tuition, it is acknowledged that one-to-one tuition is more intense than being in a class. So 25 hours of school time doesn't have to be replicated by 25 hours of one-to-one tuition. There is a trade-off there.
Yeah.
But how this is achieved can be very different. Some people go down a home schooling route. Some people will go down what's known as like flexi schooling. But what's quite interesting is if you look at Section 19 of the Education Act, it is the local authority's responsibility to provide a full-time education to children. And so it's worth talking to the local authority to see what they can facilitate for the child. Now, I'm not saying that every parent is going to have their kind of dream education for their child met, and the local authority be here, have the money, yeah, we'll have all of it, but asking them what is available in the area and what kind of, and you don't have to do that on your own. So the school will initially be
Yeah.
involved in those conversations, and then you've got people like Sendias and IPSI, which we'll put links to, won't we, in the notes
Yeah.
for this podcast.
Absolutely.
But by going down the kind of like Section 19 route,
Hmm.
you're working with the local authority to see what they can offer as a full-time education that isn't going to the school Monday to Friday from 9 till 3:30 or whatever.
Yeah.
I don't know what
You're
you would
absolutely right.
say. Yeah.
I think you're right. I think it's about being creative, isn't it? Clearly, standard solutions haven't worked by that stage, so therefore you need to do something that's different and creative. So by a mixture of home tuition, if the parents can facilitate this, got to bear in mind they might be working full time. Some of that alongside some schooling can work. There can be dual placement some occasions where you might attend your main setting for part of the week and go to a different setting some of the time. I remember a situation where I think you've mentioned forest school. One of the children we had was going to a forest school provision, which wasn't just, it was specialised for children who'd experienced trauma and so on and had social anxiety. So that was part of the arrangement. So for half a day a week, that's where he went, and that's quite appropriate. Educated off-site, that would be registered, so that it wouldn't be recorded as an absence then by the school. And like I say, dual registration, sometimes there might be an alternative provision of some kind that maybe a child could be registered at for a short period of time alongside their main setting. They're still on roll at their main setting if that happens. But yes, it does have to involve a bit of creative thinking, so the solutions can be quite bespoke, and that's probably where it needs to be. It also might be at that stage of thinking, does this child have an education, health and care plan? Because if they haven't, it could be that this level of need is presenting itself quite strongly, that maybe needs to get on with an assessment for that as well. Because it might be that for the longer term, this isn't working.
And something you just said triggered me to think that these creative solutions that we're talking about, we're not necessarily saying that they will need to be in place forever.
Oh no.
They can be time limited in themselves. So in that instant where you were saying that a young person was going to forest school kind of for one afternoon a week, that doesn't necessarily have to carry on until they're 16 or 18.
No.
It's that is the need right now, and these creative bespoke plans will also be reviewed to see if they're still meeting the needs of the child, to see how they're going, and also if they're still needed, and that would also be an instance of perhaps when a reduced timetable would work in the other way, that they've had a creative bespoke solution and then would need reduced timetable in order to work back up to coming to mainstream school for the full 5 days. So
have either of you had any experience, or have you got any views on what happens if schools say, no, it's not in their best interests to be in school full time, and as a parent you disagree?
Well, it's like any other situations, you'd have to have a discussion around that, a calm discussion, which is difficult if if things become emotional. That's where I'd advise parents to bring someone along with them, perhaps to advocate if they're finding it difficult to engage. But there has to be some discussion in which the options are explored and the evidence is considered, really, as to why, if the school does that, is making that, putting that viewpoint across, needs to be really careful and say, what is the evidence behind that?
Mm-hmm.
Why are they making that decision, or that recommendation? So, as I say, they can't be forced to. And ultimately, if a parent absolutely, despite all that, says no, then the school has to respect that. But there may be other consequences, which, by the way, the school can't use as a threat. That's another thing that the guidance says very explicitly. Schools cannot say, unless you agree to this, we will exclude, for example. That's not appropriate. It might be the case that unless we do something, he might end up being excluded despite all our best efforts. That's a slightly different way of explaining it, because it might be a genuine risk. So there has to be some sort of risk assessment anyway, I think, with regard to that, which we can come to a bit later as well, about the other risks involved in children not being full-time education. But yes, it's like any other situation. You have to try your best to negotiate your way through it and seek support and advice as a parent if you're feeling it's a bit difficult to manage, or you're not getting, if you find the conversations aren't being very productive with the school. There's plenty of support out there. But yes, I suppose that's what it comes down to, is hopefully an agreement can be reached, some sort of a compromise. But they can't force it.
And again, I think it's really important to kind of acknowledge how hard it is for parents in those types of situations, because you've got on the one hand the fact that your child is not coping, and perhaps you feel that you're working with a school who doesn't understand them, has no desire to understand them, perhaps, or perhaps you even recognise that the school has tried really, really hard, but it's still not working, and it's, you've got all that kind of like emotion going on, but there isn't an easy solution.
No.
And the solution, we know that children don't deal well with transitions. So what we want to do is to get the solution right, be that either a bespoke solution after a reduced timetable hasn't worked, or even the reduced timetable itself. And that needs to be considered and thought through before just jumping. We don't want to go out of the frying pan into the fire, do we? And so I would second what you were saying, Jason, having someone with you to advocate if you feel like you need to. And anyone who's listening from Adoption Focus, you can obviously approach the adoption support team and we can come and support you. But if you're listening and you went through another adoption agency, then Sendias and IPSA, which I mentioned before, they will be able to point you in the right direction of people who can come and speak with you.
Yeah, and people like that can come to meetings with you in the school if you need them to. So you've got that independent support alongside you. Because it's very difficult, being faced with those kind of decisions.
Jason, you mentioned carefully risk assessing and risk factors. What are they? What are the risks when our children aren't in full-time education?
There are probably more risk for the older children and young people, for teenagers especially. I mean, we know from all the evidence that children who care experience are at greater risks of all kinds of things. They're more vulnerable than most children of their age, aren't they? So, the guidance for schools is quite clear that they should be completing a risk assessment, really, once if a reduced timetable has been agreed. So, particularly for the children, if you've got worries about their vulnerabilities, because if they're not in school, particularly teenagers, it's very hard to just pen them inside the house. They're at risk of other things, so self-harm, radicalization, perhaps low-level crime, who knows, going missing. There's all those kind of risks that can suddenly be presented to them.
You can imagine,
the best
can't
in the
you?
world, going off because they're becoming disaffected. If they do feel a slight sense of rejection at school, what's the point? What's the point? We're bored. Get out. And you can imagine that mindset creeping in as influences that we wouldn't want are suddenly there.
You can also imagine, though, when the school day takes up an awful lot of time, and as I mentioned before, other options might not take up as much time, and many young people might choose to spend that extra additional time online. And
Yeah.
it could be befriending people we wouldn't want them to befriend, or it could be immersing themselves in social media, which we all know is not going to
No.
have a really positive effect on their mental health.
No.
So there's
Yeah,
a whole
absolutely.
it's also kind of what, as well as being more at risk for, like you say, radicalization or anything along those lines, it could just be more isolation, more time on your own, more time online. It's just not a nice mix.
No. Toxic combination.
Hence the point about it's got to be a temporary, short-term solution.
Mm-hmm. And I imagine there's risks to parents' mental health and well-being as well. It's already busy juggling everything, and then suddenly there's all these alternative arrangements, or you might need to be flexible with working patterns. And actually, the hours that you'd accounted for them not being in the house, they suddenly are. And that's not to blame or judge parents at all. It's really difficult.
Yeah, it is very difficult indeed. So it's got to be treated with real caution, and that's why hopefully the parents will be in agreement to this if they recognise it is actually in their situation the right decision.
I also just wanted to touch on, if that's okay, you mentioned that when there is a reduced timetable in place, we've tried lots of things until that point, it hasn't worked. But while it's in place, schools should be doing things in the background, whether that's looking to hire somebody or whatever. What things have you had experience of schools doing in the background?
Yeah, there's a couple of families I've supported, and that where that's happened, the part-time timetable has been used partly where the staff have used that time to get some training so they can understand some of the issues. If they weren't particularly well informed about trauma-informed practice and things like that and attachment, then like to use that time, especially for support staff who may have been working with that child, that can use that time to access some of the training. Staff have used it, particularly if there's a SENCO involved, to start the application process and the assessment for an education, health and care plan. So that could be useful use of time, because if it's becoming apparent that the needs are more significant, then that's an option. Use the time to start gathering that evidence, start making the phone calls, trying to get educational psychologists or whoever might be needs to be involved to support that assessment. So there's got to be some sort of consideration about what's the longer term solution here. What steps can they be taking to help? Maybe some adjustments to the physical environment. So for very young children, I think when I go back to when I was a head teacher, I did have a very, very young child who just started in reception who did end up in a special setting actually, but arrived with no support, huge levels of needs, crazy, could not cope. We had to we had to introduce a part-time timetable for the first time I'd ever done it, so that we could then create a little room for him, because he could not manage being in a classroom setting at all. I mean, literally weeing on the floor, he would run around, tear things, scream, shout, snarl, hit. It was absolutely crazy. And he did have significant attachment and difficulties and it turns out autism and all sorts of things. But however, for us, it just meant we could get a room, clear it out.
Yeah.
It was a small room, wasn't
Decorate
a classroom.
it.
It was like a small room that was used probably like a little office. We had to clear it out, decorate it, clear out the furniture, make it look inviting and friendly, put some soft furnishings in, and then he could come back in that. And that was his setting, and that became his space. And actually, it worked for the amount of time. And then we were able to work on the other.
Yeah.
That rapidly assessing for HCP, going, oh my goodness, this child is not going to be able to cope. Because that's, even in that setting, that's not sustainable for the long term, is it? A child on their own in a room with an adult, because that's not a long term solution either, because that's not inclusive. But it was better than him not being in at all. So that kind of worked to that extent.
Lisa and Jason, thank you. I feel like I've got a better understanding now of reduced timetables and how it all works. We really hope that everybody at home found this episode useful. And if your family are experiencing difficulties with the reduced timetable, like Jason and Lisa said, please don't forget to contact our post-adoption support team so we can offer some advice and guidance and be there to support you. If you've experienced something with your child or children's education that we haven't yet covered on the podcast, but you think that we should, then please do let us know. You can drop us an email at education@adoption-focus.org.uk. And as ever, thank you for listening.